Today, we are talking about the largest disaster in the history of the Soviet space and missile program. For decades, it officially did not exist. There were no memorials, no public investigations, no official acknowledgement. On October 24, 1960, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a single launch pad became the site of the deadliest pre-launch catastrophe ever caused by a rocket. In a matter of seconds, more people were killed than in any other incident of the early space age, and it happened in the presence of the highest levels of Soviet military leadership. At the center of the operation stood a new intercontinental ballistic missile known as the R-16. It was not designed for exploration or scientific achievement. It was built as a weapon. Its mission was to deliver a nuclear warhead across continents fast enough to change the balance of power. The missile was rushed into testing. The Soviet Union was engaged in an intense technological rivalry with the United States. Launch schedules were driven by political deadlines rather than engineering readiness. The planned test was tied to symbolic dates. Delay was considered failure, but the R-16 was not ready. Critical systems remained unstable. Electrical components showed faults. Fuel combinations were extremely volatile. Engineers were aware of unresolved issues. Safety checks were incomplete. Test data was fragmentary. Under normal conditions, the launch would have been postponed. Instead, pressure moved downward through the command structure. Problems were reclassified as minor. Reports were adjusted. Deviations from procedure were treated as acceptable risk. Each decision made the next one harder to reverse. By the time concerns reached higher levels, stopping the process meant admitting systemic failure. The launch pad was never meant to be crowded. Standard protocol required all personnel to be evacuated during fueling and final checks. That protocol was ignored. Engineers, technicians, officers, and observers remained near the missile. Some stood directly beneath it. Others waited nearby, expecting further instructions. Troubleshooting was carried out while the rocket was fully fueled. Manual adjustments replaced remote procedures. Safety distances were abandoned. Each intervention increased the danger, but also increased commitment to proceed. No one wanted to be responsible for a delay. No one wanted to report that the missile was not ready. At the highest level, the launch was treated as inevitable. The assumption was simple: the missile would fly, or at least attempt to. The political cost of postponement was judged greater than the technical risk. By the afternoon of October 24th, the R-16 stood fully fueled on the launch pad. Its tanks contained hypergolic propellants, chemicals that ignite instantly upon contact. There was no margin for error, no safe recovery procedure. The system was live. The pad was crowded. The countdown was no longer theoretical. And the people closest to the rocket had no way of knowing how little time remained. For more than 30 years, the catastrophe at Baikonur did not exist in official history. There were no public records, no textbooks, no memorials. The launch pad was rebuilt. New rockets stood where the old one had burned. Tests continued. The program moved forward as if nothing had happened. Internally, lessons were noted, quietly. Safety procedures were revised. Remote operations were emphasized. Crowd presence near fueled rockets was reduced. These changes were not explained publicly. They appeared in technical manuals without reference to their origin. The reason was simple. Acknowledging the disaster would have meant acknowledging its cause. It would have required admitting that deadlines had overridden safety, that procedures had been violated knowingly, that senior leadership had been present on the pad when the missile ignited, that the loss of life was not unavoidable, but systemic. That admission never came. When information finally began to surface in the late 1980s, it emerged slowly and incompletely. Archival material was released in fragments. Numbers varied. Accounts conflicted. Responsibility remained diffuse. Even then, the scale of the tragedy was difficult to reconstruct. Estimates of the dead ranged from several dozen to over 100. Exact figures remain uncertain. Some records were lost, others were never created. What remains is an outline, not a full account. The people who died were engineers, technicians, soldiers, and officers. They were not anonymous to one another. They were not expendable to their families. But within the system, they became statistics that could not be acknowledged. The Baikonur disaster did not change the direction of the Soviet space and missile program. Rockets continued to launch. Milestones were achieved, successes were celebrated. The cost was absorbed and forgotten. Only much later did historians begin to place the event in context, not as an isolated accident, but as a product of a system where secrecy, pressure, and hierarchy outweighed caution. By then, most of those involved were gone. The launch pad remained. The archives remained incomplete. The silence endured. The disaster had happened. The world simply was not meant to know. The response to the disaster was immediate and controlled. Within hours of the explosion, the site was sealed. Access to the launch pad was restricted to a limited number of authorized personnel. Guards were posted. Movement was logged. Communication with the outside world was tightly regulated. The first priority was not explanation, it was containment. Orders were issued to classify all information related to the incident. Reports were marked restricted. Casualty lists were removed from general circulation. Witnesses were instructed not to speak about what they had seen. Medical treatment followed the same logic. Survivors were treated under supervision. Injuries were documented selectively. In some cases, the cause of death was recorded using vague or misleading terminology. Families of the victims were notified without details or not notified at all. Publicly, nothing had happened. There were no announcements on radio or in newspapers, no acknowledgement of an accident at Baikonur, no mention of fatalities. The space and missile program continued to be presented as advancing steadily, without interruption. The dead were buried quietly. Funerals, where they occurred, were conducted without ceremony and without public recognition of the cause. Some burial sites were unmarked. Others listed generic causes unrelated to the disaster. The scale of the loss was deliberately obscured. Within the program itself, work resumed quickly. Launch schedules were adjusted, but not suspended. Investigations were conducted internally behind closed doors. Responsibility was diffused across technical committees and administrative layers. No single decision-maker was publicly identified. The message was clear. The disaster was to be treated as an anomaly, not as a failure of the system. Those who survived were absorbed back into routine. Those who asked questions were redirected. Those who persisted were silenced through administrative means. For decades, the event remained classified. Engineers who had been present carried the memory privately. Official histories omitted the incident entirely. The world outside the Soviet Union remained unaware that the deadliest rocket disaster in history had ever occurred. Even within the country, knowledge was limited to fragments. A rumor here, a warning there, nothing that could be verified. The silence was not accidental, it was enforced, and it would hold for more than 30 years. The most lethal part of the disaster did not end with the initial ignition. It unfolded in the seconds that followed. As the rocket disintegrated, fuel continued to burn uncontrollably. Hypergolic propellants spread across the launch pad, flowing into trenches, channels, and low points designed for drainage. Wherever the chemicals reached, fire followed instantly. There was no safe direction to run. The launch complex was a closed environment of metal structures, platforms, ladders, and barriers. These features, useful during normal operations, became obstacles during the fire. Escape routes were narrow. Visibility was almost non-existent. Those who survived the first wave of flames faced another danger. Toxic combustion products filled the air. Nitrogen tetroxide and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, the rocket's propellants, produced choking fumes when burned. Breathing became impossible within seconds. Even those not directly burned were incapacitated by the gases. Some individuals collapsed while trying to flee. Others lost consciousness before reaching open ground. The fire spread unevenly, creating pockets of intense heat interspersed with areas briefly less affected. In these gaps, a small number of people survived long enough to move away from the pad. Their survival depended almost entirely on position and timing. Not preparation, not training, chance. Emergency personnel could not approach the site immediately. The fire burned too hot, and the risk of secondary explosions remained high. Fuel continued to ignite as remaining tanks ruptured. The launch pad was effectively sealed off by flame. Only after the main fires subsided could responders begin to enter the area. What they encountered was devastation. Metal structures were twisted or melted. Equipment had collapsed into the pad. The remains of the rocket were scattered across a wide area, fused with concrete and steel. Identification of victims was difficult. The intensity of the fire left little intact. In many cases, it was impossible to determine where individuals had been standing moments earlier. Records had to be reconstructed from duty logs, eyewitness accounts, and incomplete lists of personnel present. The number of dead was immediately classified. Initial estimates varied widely. Some reports mentioned dozens, others suggested far more. Official figures would later be reduced, adjusted, and obscured. What was clear was that this was not a routine accident. It was a catastrophic failure caused by a combination of technical risk, procedural violations, and human pressure, all concentrated in a matter of seconds. By the time the fires were extinguished, the launch pad no longer resembled a test site. It was a disaster zone, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The explosion did not begin with a countdown. There was no announcement, no warning signal, no final command. What triggered the catastrophe was a technical action carried out during ongoing checks, an operation that should never have been performed on a fully fueled rocket. At some point in the late afternoon, an electrical signal was sent through the missile's systems. Whether it was a test command, a misrouted signal, or an unintended activation remains disputed in the historical record. What is known is the result. The second stage engine ignited while the rocket was still on the launch pad. The ignition was instantaneous. A jet of flame erupted downward, striking the fully fueled first stage below it. In less than a second, the hypergolic propellants ignited on contact. The launch pad was engulfed in fire. There was no explosion in the cinematic sense, no single shock wave that cleared the area. Instead, there was a sudden, overwhelming inferno. The missile collapsed into itself as fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread horizontally and vertically at the same time, flooding the launch structure and surrounding platforms. Temperatures rose beyond survivable limits almost instantly. People closest to the rocket had no chance to react. Those standing on service platforms were consumed immediately. Others below were caught in the expanding fireball, exposed to intense heat and toxic gases. Protective structures offered no shelter. The pad had been designed for access, not escape. Within seconds, the entire area became lethal. Some individuals farther from the center of the blast attempted to flee. A few managed to run clear of the immediate flames. Many did not realize what had happened until they were already surrounded by fire and smoke. Visibility dropped to zero. Burning debris fell across the pad. Fuel continued to ignite in waves as tanks ruptured one after another. The sound was not a single explosion, but a sustained roar, a continuous release of energy that lasted for tens of seconds. Emergency response was impossible. Fire suppression systems were overwhelmed immediately. Access routes were blocked by wreckage and flame. Anyone attempting to approach the pad during those first moments would have been killed. The disaster unfolded too fast for intervention. When the fire finally began to subside, the launch pad was unrecognizable. The missile no longer existed as a structure. Equipment had melted or collapsed. The ground itself was scorched and deformed. Dozens of people were dead. Others were dying. The catastrophe had reached its full scale in less than a minute, and there was nothing left to stop it. The launch pad was never designed to hold people. Under standard safety procedures, the final stages of preparation were meant to be conducted remotely. Once fueling began, all non-essential personnel were required to leave the area. Distance was the only reliable protection against what could go wrong. On October 24, 1960, those rules were ignored. As problems accumulated, the launch pad became a place of constant intervention. Engineers were called back repeatedly to inspect systems. Technicians adjusted components manually. Officers moved between teams, demanding progress and updates. Each delay brought more people closer to the rocket. By the afternoon, dozens of individuals were present on and around the pad. Some stood on service platforms beside the missile. Others waited directly below it, sitting on benches or standing in groups, watching the work continue. The scene resembled a crowded construction site rather than a high-risk weapons test. This was not accidental. The missile had already been fueled. Draining the tanks would have taken hours and introduced additional danger. Canceling the test would have required admitting that the launch had been authorized prematurely. Instead, the decision was made to continue troubleshooting with the rocket fully armed. The environment became increasingly unstable. Hypergolic propellants filled the tanks, substances that ignite instantly upon contact, leaving no room for error. Vapors accumulated. Systems remained powered. Electrical circuits were active while personnel worked nearby, often without full protective equipment. Warnings were raised. Some engineers expressed concern about the growing number of people on the pad. Others pointed out that safety protocols were being violated systematically. These concerns were acknowledged and dismissed. The belief persisted that catastrophic failure was unlikely and that the situation could still be controlled. Authority played a critical role. High-ranking officials were present on site, observing preparations directly. Their presence altered behavior. Decisions that might have been delayed or questioned under normal conditions were accelerated. No one wanted to appear hesitant in front of senior leadership. As a result, safety became secondary to demonstration. Instead of clearing the pad, more specialists were summoned. Instead of powering down systems, adjustments continued with full electrical load. Instead of stepping back, people moved closer. The launch pad became a convergence point for responsibility. Engineers focused on technical fixes. Officers focused on timelines. Administrators focused on reporting progress. No single group had full authority to stop the process, and no one wanted to be the first to say it could not proceed. This fragmentation mattered. When responsibility is divided, risk is multiplied. By late afternoon, the missile stood ready in appearance only. Critical faults had not been resolved. Systems were in ambiguous states. Safety interlocks were bypassed or disabled to allow continued testing. Yet the pad remained crowded. Some individuals waited for instructions that never came. Others believed the most dangerous phase had already passed. A few sensed something was wrong, but lacked the authority to act on it. The assumption that held everything together was simple and fatal. If disaster were truly possible, someone would have stopped it. No one did. And with every minute that passed, the number of people within the lethal radius of the rocket remained unchanged.